Hello everybody, we're going to be moving on now to our physiology content for Unit 2. And we're going to be moving up the levels of organization in Unit 2. So during Unit 1, after we had our intro to the body, then in Chapter 2 we talked about atoms and molecules that make up the human body. And then we climbed up the levels in Chapter 3 where we had kind of a basic introduction to the cells of the body and their structures and how they work. Now we're moving up one more level here in Chapter 4. We're going to talk about the different tissues that the body is constructed of. And after we cover Chapter 4, in Chapter 5, we will move on to our first body system. We're going to cover the integumentary system, which is the skin. And the skin is surprisingly complex and interesting. I think you'll like learning about it. So we'll be learning lots of new stuff here. Unit 2 is heavier in physiology content than anatomy content. I will have a separate area for you on the Unit 2 anatomy. It will not be quite as extensive as what you had to learn for Unit 1. And because of that, the anatomy test for Unit 2 is actually only a 50-point test. Your physiology test will be once again, a 75-point test like you had for the first unit. All right, so what in the world do we mean by tissues? Your textbook describes tissues as the living fabrics, which I think is I think that's a pretty good analogy for tissues. Tissues consist of cells. Cells make up your tissues. But then, as you're going to see, many tissues have some pretty big gaps between the cells. So if you got a cell here in a tissue and you got a cell over here, you'll have this filler space in between that does not consist of cells. You've got fluid and solutes and lots of proteins and other types of molecules in there that fill in those spaces. Those spaces between your cells, and we've talked about this before, but here's another reminder, that's called the extracellular matrix. So all that filler material you have between individual cells can be called that. Some types of tissues in the body have a lot of extracellular matrix. Other tissue types in the body don't have quite as much. All right, another term you guys should become familiar with: histology. That is the study of tissues. If you were taking a traditional anatomy and physiology class, you might spend some time in this unit working with microscopes in the laboratory and looking at a few example tissues under the microscope. So that study of tissues using microscopy is called histology. All right, you're going to see that in different kinds of tissues, you will have different cell types that vary in their shapes. They'll vary in the things that they do. And then the extracellular matrix will vary from one type of tissue to the other. All right, another thing you should become quickly familiar with, there are 4 major kinds of tissues in the body: epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. Now the muscular and the nervous tissues, we will primarily discuss those when we get to Units 4 and 5 at the end of the semester. But we'll have a pretty good overview, a pretty thorough overview of epithelial and connective type tissues here in Unit 2. All right, so as I said, your 4 major tissue types are nervous, muscular or muscle, and then epithelial and connective. And so where do you have your nervous tissues? All right, not too surprisingly, your nervous tissues make up your brain, your spinal cord, and then also those cranial and spinal nerves that we learned about in Unit 1, and all of those branches that extend throughout the body. Your nervous system is composed of nervous tissues. That's not too surprising. Your nervous tissues are very much involved in communication, signaling. Remember when we were discussing homeostasis in Unit 1, we talked about how receptors send signals to command centers, and then command centers send signals back to effectors, if you remember that from your kind of typical homeostatic pathways in Chapter 1. And very often those signals are being sent along the nervous system. The nervous system also generates these electrical signals based on charge changes, which you'll learn about in when we get to Unit 5. All right, muscle tissue not too surprising to you, is involved in contractions for movements. Some of your muscle tissues are voluntary and some are involuntary. So what's the difference between those two? Voluntary, you can think about contracting the muscles before you actually do so. You have conscious control over that. Involuntary, those are muscular contractions that happen without you thinking about it. All right, your only voluntary muscle tissue is your skeletal muscle tissue. Your skeletal muscles are, like they're showing you over here on the diagram, those are what you typically think of muscles. Those are muscles that contract, they pull on your bones and cause movements at joints. So those are the muscles that allow us to move around and also help us maintain posture. Now those are the only muscles that you have conscious voluntary control over. The other two types you see over here, smooth and cardiac muscle, those are involved in involuntary contraction. And we'll talk a little bit more later about where you would find smooth muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue, I imagine you can figure out, would be located in your heart. And as you know, you don't consciously have to think about your heart beating. Those muscular tissues in the wall of your heart do that all on their own. All right, the next two, and the two types that we'll spend the most time here in Chapter 4 discussing, epithelial type tissues. Epithelial tissues form coverings and linings. And so because of that, they form boundaries. You find them at borders between either the outside and the inside of the body, or within the body, you find them at borders between different compartments and spaces. All right, and then, sorry about that little technical glitch here in my office. What else is new? Okay, so also there are specialized epithelial tissues that are involved in secretion. So when we think about glands in the body that produce substances and release them to perform various functions, those are actually special types of epithelial tissues that we'll talk about a little bit more later. And then also wherever you absorb things in the body, that's another function you want to associate with your epithelial tissues. Many types of epithelial tissues are involved in absorbing substances, like in the lungs where you absorb oxygen gas, or down here in your small intestine where you absorb the monomers like sugars and amino acids and fatty acids and things like that from the foods that you've eaten. The tissue that lines the inside of the intestinal tract is going to be a type of epithelial tissue. And as we'll see when we discuss epithelial tissues in more detail, those types of tissues have very little extracellular matrix. They're usually consist of cells that are jam-packed pretty tightly together, and that's one of the features that gives them some of their special properties. All right, so everywhere else in the body, you have what are called connective tissues. So if you're not looking at a lining or a covering of some kind, or a gland that secretes something, or muscular tissue of some type, or nervous tissue of some type, pretty much everywhere else in the body, then you're going to have these connective type tissues. And as the name suggests, connective tissues tend to connect one part of the body with another, one type of tissue to another. I like to think of them as your filler tissues. They fill up spaces between other types, other structures. So they provide support to the body. For example, your bones are actually a type of connective tissue. Protection, cushioning, your fatty tissues are actually a type of connective tissue. And again, they fill spaces, they bind, like the tissues that fill up the spaces between your skin at the surface and the muscles that underlie the skin, those are all connective type tissues. Also, your connective tissues provide passageways. So those are the types of tissues where you're going to find most of your blood vessels and your nerves and things like that that have to serve all of the various nitty-gritty little locations in the body. Those are going to largely pass through the various connective kinds of tissues in the body. And we'll see lots of different examples of connective type tissues. All right, why in the world do I have a hunk of pork shoulder up here? So I put this up here because it's something that many of us are likely familiar with. We've all seen a hunk of meat like this at some time. So the next time you're at home and you have unless you're a vegan, vegetarian, but otherwise the next time you're at home with a hunk of meat, you can think about all these different tissues that are there. So how if you have a pork shoulder, you can often have some of the skin there still on the surface. Well, the skin, that is a covering. It is a boundary between the underlying tissues and the outside of the body. Okay, so your skin there is going to be a type of epithelial tissue. Now think about below the skin, the covering on this pork shoulder, you would have some fat underlying there. So all that fatty tissue there is connective tissue because that is connecting this epithelial tissue of the skin to the underlying pork shoulder meat down here. What we know of as meat is actually skeletal muscle tissue. So you can see how you have that different layering there. You have epithelial at a surface, a boundary. Underneath that you have this underlying skeletal muscle tissue, and then you need some filler in between, and those are going to be your connective tissues. So you have fat in there, but when we study the skin, you're going to see that you have some other types of connective tissue in there besides the fat that are a little bit thinner at the surface. Then here's another example I like to show. This is a piece of the intestinal wall. So if you cut that open, you would find in the intestinal wall, and this is going to be true for the walls of many organs in the body, an intestinal wall is actually made up of several different kinds of tissues, and then they're woven together, these tissue-type fabrics, to build the organ that we know of as the small intestine. So if you looked inside, up close, at the wall of a small intestine, the inside lining is going to be composed of epithelial type tissue. So again, the skin is a type of epithelial tissue, but if you look inside the body, wherever you have a covering around an internal space, that lining that you have there is going to be composed of epithelial type tissue. So that's what you would have there at the surface. The cells there of those epithelial tissues are going to be involved with absorbing nutrients from your diet. All right, and then let's look over here at the surface of this organ. Over here, remember that the small intestine is contacted by the visceral peritoneum, that serous membrane. And the visceral peritoneum, it's a thin membrane, but if you looked at it at a detailed microscopic level, you would see there that you do have an epithelial lining at the surface that's facing the fluid in the peritoneal cavity. And then you have a little thin strip of connective tissue. I mean, we're talking microscopically thin underneath that epithelial layer. And then notice within the wall of the small intestine here, all of that area there, that consists of smooth muscle tissue. So you actually have muscular type tissue in the walls of the organs of the digestive tract, and those muscle cells in there actually contract and relax, and that's what helps squeeze the food that you're digesting along your digestive tract from one place to another. All right, so those types of things are easy to visualize, but then what do you have in between there in the wall? So you've got this epithelial lining all along here, and then you've got this muscular tissue within the wall that's closer to the edges of the wall, and then all this white stuff you see here in between, that's going to be connective tissue, because connective tissues connect one location or one type of tissue to another. And within there, if you notice here, let me erase my scribbling I've put on here. Notice on this diagram how they've got these blood vessels over here, and those blood vessels are infiltrating into the connective tissues. Like I was telling you, connective tissues can provide passageways. For blood vessels, you have to have blood vessels extending to all parts of your body, or almost all parts of your body, because the blood brings fluid and nutrients and electrolytes and all those good things to all of the cells of your body to nourish those so that they can have their needs met. Also, your blood has to carry away the wastes that those cells manufacture. So that's another example showing you an organ like the small intestine and how it is woven together from these different types of tissues in the body. All right, so we are going to, that finishes our little intro to tissues. And so what we're going to do on our next lecture clip, we're going to start talking about epithelial tissues in a little bit more detail.